All right, welcome back to part two of working with plasticine clay. Now that you've had an opportunity to play with the clay, manipulate the clay, try some things, get a little bit of experience under your belt, now I want to go back and talk about a few more concepts that are just a little bit more sophisticated. All right, so that first concept that I want to talk about is a thing called undercuts. Undercuts are the devil in mold making. They're the single most problematic concept in mold making. But I've chosen alginate to use as our mold making material because it's a flexible material, and so it's going to be a little more forgiving with regard to undercuts, which means we're going to get away with undercuts. Not only are we going to get away with them, we might even take advantage of that fact and try to use them a little bit to enhance our image. So let me show you what an undercut is. All right, so if you take a look at this, so I can get it in the camera here. There we go. You can see that this area right here overhangs this area. So this area is under this area, and that is an undercut. What's going to happen is the mold making material is going to flow over and around and get underneath that. Now, if this were a plaster mold, it would be very unforgiving and you wouldn't be able to get your original out of the mold if you had an undercut like that. But because this is alginate and alginate's flexible, we're probably going to get away with that degree of undercut. Now, I would probably make sure that I didn't have much more of an angle than that, but I think we'll be able to get away with that degree of an undercut. So be conscious of that as you work. All right. I want to talk to you about a couple of other things that you might want to avoid as you're working on your clay image. So we'll take this pretend clay image here and we'll do some things that we're not going to get away with. One thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't put tall appendage-like things on the clay, right? I wouldn't stick a bunch of things like this on the clay. All right, you can see what I've done there. You're not going to get away with casting that. The alginate's going to get down between those, and then when you try to take this apart in a little bit, those bits of clay that you added on there are going to stick in the alginate mold, and you're not going to be able to get them out. Even if you could get them out, you won't get the casting material to go down in those skinny, deep holes. So you want to avoid those kinds of thin, linear, spiky things. You know, you don't want to do something that's very thin-edged either. You don't want to try to take some thin edge, oops. You don't want to try to take some thin edge like that. I don't know if you can see how thin that is. You don't want to take a thin edge like that and put it on your image because you won't be able to cast that either. You can see how thin that is. The alginate will wrap around it, and then when you take the mold apart, that clay will get stuck in the mold, then you won't be able to cast that. So you want to avoid those kinds of things. Another thing you want to avoid is sticking some component way out in space. You know, if you've got some great big component that you're trying to stick out in space, you're not going to get away with that. You know, you're not going to get away with that sticking out into the mold. You're also not going to get away with having a part leave the surface of the mold and then come back, or leave the surface of the shield and then come back on it. You're not going to be able to cast that for obvious reasons. So that would cause a big problem in mold making. So those are some of the things that you want to try to avoid. All right? Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about working with your image. One of the things that I'm going to tell you is the same thing that I'm going to tell all my drawing students, is that you have a fairly weak visual memory. That is, it's hard for you to conjure up a very accurate image in your mind. And think about this. Think about computers. If I send a text, it goes right now. If I send a photograph, it's a little slower. If I send a video, it takes forever. And the reason is simple. It's more data. So if you try to remember what something looks like, your brain isn't set up to remember what something looks like. It's too much data. Because of that, you need really excellent reference. All right, so if you're sculpting an image, in this case, I'm sculpting a hand and a bit of a skull, I had a photograph of the skull right in front of me. Better yet, I would have had a three-dimensional object right in front of me. But I had a photograph, and I worked really closely with that photograph. So excellent reference is terrifically important. If you try to create an image and you just pull it out of thin air or someplace worse, when you're finished with that image, you're going to be dissatisfied with it. And you're going to feel like something's wrong with that image, but you won't be able to know exactly what that is. If you have an excellent reference, you will be able to minimize some of those kinds of things. All right, so reference is really important. Another tip I want to talk about, and this I discovered a long time ago, but I really think it's valuable. If I'm trying to create something that is symmetrical, that is, I want both sides to be the same, I'm going to work with both my right hand and my left hand simultaneously. And you might say, well, gee, Vance, my left hand isn't very good. I'm not very capable with my left hand. I couldn't possibly make sculpture with my left hand. And here's what I will tell you. That might be true. But when you work on something and you use both hands at the same time, all you have to do is think about what your dominant hand is doing, and your subordinate hand will just follow along for the ride. But if you're working on something and it's a symmetrical something, I always work with both hands at the same time. It really, really helps me to keep things symmetrical. It's faster because I can work in two areas at once. And I'm really a believer that your right hand will tell, or your dominant hand will tell your subordinate or your non-dominant hand what to do. So if I'm working on something that's symmetrical, I'll usually try to work with both hands at the same time. All right, another tip I want to give you is to do with your imaging. I would exaggerate my images. This is a relief image. It's a monochromatic image, so you don't have any ability to separate areas with color. So one of those things that I'm going to do is I'm going to exaggerate things a lot. Like if you look at this skull, there's the edge of the eye orbit, right, and the edge of the temporal area. So I have exaggerated that quite a bit. I don't know if you'll be able to see this in the video, but I've exaggerated that quite a bit. I've exaggerated this edge right here quite a bit. And I've exaggerated how far that tucks under. And I think that's important to help you perceive my image accurately. So I would exaggerate things. I would make details sharper. I would make separations crisper. I would do those kinds of things to help improve my image. All right. The last thing I want to talk about before I let you go is texture. Texture is your best friend when it comes to separating areas within the composition. So texture can be created a lot of different ways. You know, you can do an additive thing. You know, I could, if I wanted, do something like this. Yeah, it's going to cause me a little problems in casting, but it's not going to be completely undoable, right? So I could do something additive. Now, what's the difference between these and the little spikes that I had a minute ago? The difference primarily is height. You know, these are flat and the spikes before were tall. So I could do something texturally like that if I wanted to easily enough. But a lot of your textures are going to come from pressing into the clay rather than building things up from the clay. So anything that you can pick up, you can press into the clay. And it's not just that you're pressing a certain thing in, but how you press it in. You know, so I can get this kind of little golf ball texture pretty easily if I push straight down. but I get something entirely different if I use the same tool and push it in from a steep side angle. All right, so I get something completely different with the same tool. You can also create texture with carving. I can take my little potter's trimming tool and I can carve out areas to create texture. One of the things that I think is pretty cool that you saw in that texture video, if you watched it, is the idea of using plastic to help mute or subdue the texture that you're creating. By sealing the plastic against the clay, it can really have a big impact on how your texture looks. So it really softens it a lot and kind of pulls the edges in. So that's kind of a nice thing. Texture is one of those things that I really want you to play with. I want you to manipulate it. Texture isn't one of those things that you can sit down and think about. It's something that you have to see, and it's something that you have to react to. You know, try any kind of thing that you want to create texture. And there's no such thing as a bad texture. All right, so play with texture. Try a lot of different things on a scrap piece of clay before you actually start working on this. You know, one of the things that happens frequently in art that I think is really the cool thing is when the artist's mark becomes apparent, or when the process the artist is using becomes an important part of the composition. It's real easy to think about in drawing if you're making charcoal marks, you know, and those marks are an exact reflection of what your hand is doing. But the same thing can happen working dimensionally. You know, I could literally mark this, draw into this, and the viewer would then get an opportunity to see a little bit about my process, right? So that's something that I would think about incorporating too. All right. All right, so I want to show you a little bit, one more thing here. I want to show you what I've done with texture here to help separate figure from ground. Remember, you don't have value to work with, but if you'll notice, I've put that golf ball pebbly texture in the background, and I'm contrasting that against the smooth texture of my skull, and it helps move my skull forward in the picture plane. And that's an important tool. That's an important trick, an important device. You know, one of the things that you have to do to be successful as a relief sculptor is you have to sort of think a little bit like a drawer, right? Because relief sculpture is, I hate to even say this, but it's kind of like dimensionalized drawing. And you have to look for some of those same tricks that drawers might use. You know, drawers would use value contrast. Well, we're going to have to use texture contrast. Drawers use lines. Lines are a really important tool. If I took this little bevel tool that I have right here, if you can see that bevel, and if I want to separate, visually separate figure from ground, what I can do is I can create a little undercut right here, and that little undercut is going to cast a shadow. It's going to function like a line. So if I took a minute, take a look at this and see that I don't have a really distinction. I mean, I have a distinction. There's definitely an edge, but it's not a powerfully visual distinction. So if I take this little tool and I start pressing down and in a little bit, you know, now I've got a super strong line right there. So I've used that drawer's trick of using a line to help separate figure from ground. So if you've got a lot of drawing experience, excellent. I would try to incorporate as much of that into this process as I could. All right, so like I said, there's a really good video on texture, and I put a couple other videos up that show a couple other people sculpting relief images in oil-based clay, so you can watch those. But I hope you got a little bit out of this. And again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask your instructors. Have a good day and good luck.